What does capitalism learn from the left? Um, we begin in the French Revolution. Really, we can begin earlier than this. We can begin in the American Revolution. While there were not officially left and right wings of the American Revolution or the political system that emerged out of this, these originated in the French Revolution. There were still identifiable cliques that, of course, eventually became the Federalist and the Democratic Republican parties under John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, respectively. The Federalists were a centralizing force. Alexander Hamilton was basically their primary theoretician, and they believed in the power of central states to direct a process of industrialization. They were also the more identifiably conservative party at the time, even in an American context, despite their association with centralization and with modernization. They opposed, generally as a rule, they opposed the French Revolution and its excesses. They opposed popular democracy. They opposed popular sovereignty. And they supported the rule of the northern industrialists. At the same time, and this historical legacy carried over into the Whigs and then into the Republicans, they opposed slavery not on any kind of moral basis and not necessarily as radical abolitionists. Some of them supported colonization, such as Henry Clay. Others just wanted to contain slavery to the American South. But they did so because it was in competition with the essential logic of the free labor position that they supported based on their own economic interests. Thomas Jefferson was the leader and chief theoretician of the Democratic Party. And of course, he eventually became president. Hamilton never could have because he was born in the Caribbean. Jefferson's position was agrarian yeomanry as the basis of the new American state. He supported agrarian slavery, and of course, he himself was a slave owner. But his position on slavery was much more nuanced than that of later slave owners, such as Calhoun, who essentially invented racial science in order to justify their own position. He lived in the rosy dawn of independent American chattel slavery, so to speak. The cotton gin had yet to be introduced on a wide scale during his lifetime. And so he was compelled to treat his slaves and to treat the subject with a little more dignity than this. Jefferson envisioned, as I have said, a citizenry consisting of independent, self-sufficient, self-interested agrarian yeomen. And he opposed Northern industrialism. He opposed Hamilton. He opposed the Federalist Party. And he was the father of the Democratic Republican Party. However, within this, what's called by American historians, first party system, there is a switch in what is called the era of good feelings. The Democratic Republican Party, now led by James Monroe, goes uncontested after the Federalists dissolve. And their ideas are superficially assimilated into the Democratic Republican Party. Whereas Jefferson had been completely and irrevocably hostile to any centralized bank, to any official, currency, to hard money. Monroe was open to these ideas and admitted some of them into his cabinet. And this is really what led to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Republican Party, breaking apart. Now, overseas in France, conversely, around this time, you have the French Revolution, which was divided into various clubs. You had the Girondins, you had Le Montaigne, Les Cordiers, and these various clubs represented various factions of the left wing of the French Revolution. The dominant position was that represented by Robespierre for a time. They were not a radical socialist movement. They were not a leveling movement. They supported basic bourgeois rights and liberties, which at the time were seen as something incredibly frightful. They were ultra-democratic. There's a difference here, but the modern left does not care to draw it. And Robespierre was ultimately deposed precisely because because of his democratism. The terror was a democratic movement, and this was unacceptable to the more conservative elements within the Revolutionary Party there. So Robespierre was deposed, he was beheaded, and eventually the circumstances allowing for the rise of Napoleon were created. While this is going on, back in America, you have this transition within the Democratic Republican Party and its eventual fracturing into the Jacksonian Democrats and into the National Republicans and thence the Whigs. Jackson was essentially the heir to Jefferson, but Jefferson detested Jackson, and Jackson was a much more stridently hardliner anti-industrialist than was Jefferson, and much more stridently pro-slavery. Now, this is counterbalanced by the fact that he did not support secession. He was violently against it. He came to loathe John C. Calhoun over the Petticoat Affair, which is probably the first instance of um, cultural politics, culture conflict in American history. Now, with Jackson, he had the support of Northern unions. And this alliance was forced into being to undermine the interests of the Northern industrial bourgeoisie. Jackson can be seen as left wing within an American context. He was the first great populist president, presaging, for example, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who always attended the Jefferson Jackson Day dinners as president and held himself up to that standard. But Jackson was not really a friend of the working man. His interests were not coterminous with theirs. He had no interest in actually empowering the laborers. His only interest was in keeping the power of the Northern industrial bourgeoisie in check. So Jackson introduced this anti-secessionist logic into the American presidency, even though he was a Southerner and even though he was a slave owner. Moving on in American history a little bit, the next president to really have to deal with this was Zachary Taylor. He was a Whig president. Now, the Whigs had historically been associated with the North. But Taylor was from Louisiana, and he was a slave owner, but he was also a hero of the Mexican-American War and had a national reputation, and the Whigs eventually convinced him to run on their ticket. Well, the Whigs had inherited the position from the National Republicans of John Quincy Adams, which in turn inherited their anti-slavery position from the Federalists of John Adams. And Taylor was also, again, forced to take a stand during his presidency against the Fire Eaters, who were pro-slavery, anti-system fire eaters who supported chattel slavery to the hilt. Zachary Taylor threatened to lead the military against them, which seems to be in contradistinction to his interest as a slave owner, but is perfectly in keeping with the logic of the American presidency. And he, a Southerner, drew on the legacy left to him by Andrew Jackson, who was also a Southerner in doing so. So after Taylor, you have a history of dough faces coming into the office. You have Pierce and you have Buchanan. And Pierce and Buchanan were Northerners who were sympathetic to the Southern cause. They could be regarded as conservative of the Southern way of life, but were not Southerners. And this is another dialectical contradiction existing within the American presidential system. The Republicans formed an opposition basically to this branch of the Democratic Party, and they consisted of northern industrialists who were moderates on the slavery issue and wanted to retain the Whig position of being hostile to any expansion of slavery, particularly expansion into Cuba or expansion into Mexico or expansion westward toward the Rockies, and wanted to contain it. Just as much later, policy of containment was launched against the Soviet Union, or what they called 49ers, who were very often socialists, but more typically liberal nationalists fleeing the revolutions of 1848 in Germany to America, or were farmers in the Midwest who were afraid of being cut out by Southern planters bringing chattel slavery into the free states. These were the three basic stools of economic interest within the Republican Party. But it did represent essentially a left wing, even though a staunchly pro-capitalist, with the exception of an element of the 49ers coalition. William Seward represented the extreme anti-slavery position. Lincoln was the moderate. And the socialistic 49ers were much more in favor of Seward, even though he had more linkage with the capitalist interests than did Lincoln. Lincoln was more or less a genuine self-made man. So Lincoln won the nomination and came into office, and the South immediately threatened secession and seceded. Even before he was in office, and the Buchanan administration did nothing to prevent this. So Lincoln inherited a situation in which the Union was falling apart politically, and this had to represent the underlying friction in the mode of production between North and South. Again, Lincoln can be seen as a modernizer, and he presaged, in a lot of ways, even left-wing movements of the 20th century in his actual policies. Where previously America had vacillated between a gold and a bimetallic standard. Sometimes silver was counted as legitimate money, sometimes not, more typically not. Lincoln, as a war measure, introduced the greenback policy, and after the war, there was a whole American political party that wanted to do nothing but bring the greenback into currency. Because this would relieve debtors, because this money was not backed by anything except for the full faith and credit of the United States government. And this presages modern fiat money. And this is why modern libertarians, who are not necessarily racist or pro-slavery, have such an animus against Lincoln. Lincoln, again, could be identified almost as a realigning figure like FDR. But the war came, and the government centralized power, and even in a few small instances nationalized industry. The Confederates, for their much vaunted independence and their states' rights positions, were in a lot of ways even more centralist than was the Union. Secession from the Confederacy was explicitly prohibited in their constitution. And they officially codified slavery into law. You could not, a state in the Confederacy could not, by law, prohibit slaves or the importation of slaves into their territory. They also had a draft. So the war came, and the Union won. And as a consequence, the system of unwaged slavery was destroyed, and wage labor was imposed upon the South. Jim Crow is essentially nothing other than an attempt to regulate the wage labor of Southern blacks, and in particular to prevent internal conflicts on a class basis within the Southern working class between whites and blacks in order to retain the social peace. This sounds a little too charitable to the Jim Crow system, and it was every bit as horrible as you might imagine. But the logic behind it was not necessarily thoroughly anti-black, even though it produced anti-black sentiments within the population there. I should also mention that Ulysses S. Grant, in the course of fighting the war, was responsible for making an attempt to evict all of the Jews out of the states that he came across during his campaign, but that's neither here nor there. Back to the post-war period. Many of the Southerners, and I'm going to have to look this one up, my memory slips me here, were progressives, and many of them combined anti-black political sentiment with staunch liberal left progressivism. And this is a history that the Democratic Party and liberal progressives today do not particularly care to address. Ben Tillman, Pitchfork Ben, was the governor of South Carolina from 1890 until 1894, and the senator there from 1895 until his death in 1918. He was actually considered a possible candidate for president in 1896 until he gave a disastrous convention speech. But he began as a progressive. Let's see. Agricultural Moses. Having risen to the rank of captain in his rifle club before the end of the 1876 campaign, Tillman spent the next several years managing his plantations. He played a modest role in Edgefield's political and social life, and in 1881 was elected second in command of the Edgefield Hussars, a rifle club that had been made part of the state militia. In an attempt to better conditions for the farmer, by which Tillman always meant white males only, in 1884 he founded the Edgefield Agricultural Club. It died for lack of members. Undeterred, Tillman tried again in January 1885, beginning the Edgefield County Agricultural Society. Its membership also dwindled, but Tillman was elected one of 3 delegates to the August joint meeting of the State Grange and the State Agricultural and Mechanical Society at Bennettsville, and was invited to be one of the speakers. So Tillman is an example of a left-wing demagogue in the South who played up a left populist rhetorical position while still advancing racial segregation and Jim Crow. And this was not uncommon at the time. Many Southerners, deep into the 20th century, approached these issues in the same way. And this fed into the populism of the William Jennings Bryan campaign in 1896. Now, before Bryan, the National Democratic Party was largely Bourbonist. Most of their nominees throughout the 20th century staked out positions that were to the right of the National Republicans on economic issues, even though neither one of them were even remotely radical in nature, not even close. Bryan changed all of this, and the way that he did it was by appealing to a pre-existing Southern and Midwestern agricultural class that needed cheap money. And the way that he was going to do this was to mine and mint silver. Now, this happened to coincide with the interests of mining companies in Colorado and in Utah and in the rest of the Rocky Mountain states. So his was not a populist movement by any stretch of the imagination, in the sense of having no corporate support. Bryan was a corporate man, but just of a much smaller and more thoroughly defined coalition of interests than the Republicans at the time. And this is another example, like the era of good feelings under Monroe, of the parties superficially switching their platforms or taking in the logic of the opposing party without necessarily switching, at least at first, their over electoral bases. Bryan lost in 1896 running on his Silverite and anti-interventionist planks. He ran in 1900 against the Spanish-American War, and he sort of loosened his stridency on free silver, and he lost again to did he run against Theodore Roosevelt that year? I suppose he did. and he lost also in 1908. This introduces the logic of something approximating modern left liberalism into the Democratic Party. Conversely, the Republicans now, William McKinley was assassinated in 1901 by Leon Czolgosz, and Theodore Roosevelt came into power. Theodore Roosevelt had been a famous naturalist and historian. He was a man of the progressive left, though there's very little that was actually progressive about Theodore Roosevelt. He was pro-union, but this only goes so far because unions, as is easily understood, are integrated fully into the capitalist system. They do nothing to oppose it. They are incapable of standing outside of it. Theodore Roosevelt was also a eugenicist, although he was not as militantly anti-black as a Southern Democrat would have been of his age. He was basically anti-everything else. He was militantly anti-Asian, stridently anti-Indian, anti-African, and anti-immigrant. But these were considered progressive positions at the time. And there's no inherent contradiction between any of this and the whole range of bourgeois progressivism. So we continue to move on. Woodrow Wilson, with the backing of William Jennings Bryan, gets the Democratic presidential nomination in 1912. And Wilson runs on a campaign of being more progressive than William Howard Taft, who was Theodore Roosevelt's successor. But herein lies the rub. William Howard Taft actually broke up more trusts than did the great trustbuster, his predecessor, Teddy Roosevelt. Taft also has the distinction of being the first sitting Republican president to have invited a black person into the White House. However, William Howard Taft also instituted the first explicit and nationally based Southern strategy in Republican Party history. This occurred way before the Southern strategy of Goldwater or Nixon or Reagan that is so readily identified by historiographers today. This Southern strategy is rooted in what was called the Lily White movement that was present throughout the South in Southern Republican parties in the late 19th century. These parties, which were driven in particular by the Texan and North Carolinian Republican parties, wanted to form a party that was for whites only and could compete with Southern Democrats on a racial basis. Jeter Pritchard, I think, was the North Carolina senator and a Republican who explicitly and overtly campaigned on these themes of racial domination. And this, as I mentioned, this was also prevalent in the Texan Republican Party. William Howard Taft gave patronage jobs to the Lily Whites in the Southern Republican parties. And this, and not the movement in the 60s, marks the transformation, or the initial transformation of the Republican Party into the bastion of hard-right conservatism as we know it today. But it was inaugurated under a progressive, under William Howard Taft. So, moving forward, Woodrow Wilson was a staunch demagogue and a racist and also a progressive, but we already knew this, and he was also a friend of organized labor. He also imprisoned Eugene Debs, so there's no socialism to be found in his platform, even if he instituted the Federal Reserve, which some libertarians link up with the national banking system called for under the Communist Manifesto as one of the planks, even though Marx and Engels later disavowed this, as you can read in the 1872 preface to the German edition of the Communist Manifesto. Nevertheless, moving forward, there was a major backlash to Wilson's push to enter World War I in support of the Anglophone countries. He was a staunch Anglophone and a militant supporter of England and their aristocracy. So Wilson stridently pressed forward on this, And there was a backlash. Bryan, who had been his Secretary of State, I believe, actually left the administration over it. But at any rate, Wilson he had a stroke in 1919 and was eventually squeezed out because his wife Edith had basically taken over the presidency. Moving forward, Warren Harding was elected. He was a conservative, but he was not. He exhibited some progressive tendencies also. Harding instituted, for example, the first federal welfare program for indigent mothers and their progeny. Harding eventually died, I believe, of some. I think he had the flu or acquired the flu while he was on vacation in Alaska. And Coolidge came in. Now, Coolidge had been made famous for breaking a strike while governor of Massachusetts of the policemen in Boston. And he had dismantled this and acquired a reputation as a national conservative. He was significantly to the right of either his immediate successor, Herbert Hoover, or of his predecessor, Harding. Coolidge was the only thing that Coolidge is really notable for ideologically is pioneering the use of the media as president. Even though he was famous as Silent Cal, and herein lies another contradiction, he courted the media. He courted celebrities. For example, Al Jolson, who was a famous a celebrity at the time. I can't remember exactly what the fuck Jolson did now. He brought him into the White House, and he opened the doors to the press, and he made sure that he was associated with these figures. Coolidge declines to run after the death of his son, and Herbert Hoover comes in. Now, Hoover is associated with the progressive wing of the Republican Party, and these existed particularly in the Mountain West at the time, although some New England and Midwestern Republicans were also progressives. And Hoover was the president who, of course, presided over the Great Depression. Hoover initially tried to combat it by instituting measures to hike taxes. He tried austerity, and it didn't work. Hoover moves and implements the New Deal before FDR is ever president. And libertarians like Amity Shales are famous for bitching about this, and they're right. They are completely right. Hoover governs in a way that's actually not too indistinguishable from Woodrow Wilson about a decade before. He governs as a socially conservative, pro-prohibition supporter of the Lily White movement in the South, while implementing all sorts of efficiency measures and progressive measures. Hoover gets landslid out by FDR, and all of us know this story. FDR is probably the first modern left liberal in office, but he himself is also no friend of the working man. Famously, he refused to support the AFL-CIO strikes at the height of the Battle of Detroit. And while he did give official recognition to unions, the only function that this can possibly serve is to bring them into the whole system of capitalist production. FDR goes and gets, he wins landslide after landslide. The Republicans in 1940 nominate a man named Wendell Willkie, who had overseen, I believe he had overseen the Tennessee Valley Authority and the rural electrification program there. Willkie was a progressive, and he helped to push the Republican Party at the behest of the British intelligence establishment into supporting intervention in World War II. This was a coordinated, more or less conscious effort driven by all these parties. FDR, meanwhile, at the 1940 convention, nobody really wanted to put him up for a third term. It had never been done. He and some of his henchmen have cheers piped into the arena where the convention was held, saying, "We want, FDR, FDR, FDR," in order to whip up support for a third term. But that was also manufactured. So again, World War II occurs. And FDR wins again in 1944. The Republicans are starting to build up conservative resentment against the domination of these left liberal but not socialist presidents and movements throughout the course of American history in a very understandable way. I get it. And the Republican Party tries one more time to moderate itself in the form of the Eisenhower 52 nomination. Robert Taft, the son of former President William Howard Taft, was considered the heir apparent going into 1944, but he lost out to Thomas Dewey, and again into 1948 and lost to Thomas Dewey. And he was apparently going to make one more attempt for it in 1952, and the Republicans courted Dwight Eisenhower to stop this movement, to stop the emergence of a conservative, and to put their man in the White House. Eisenhower governed essentially as an heir apparent to FDR. He did little to roll back the New Deal programs that FDR had implemented. And in a letter to his brother, he called people who opposed Social Security stupid oilmen, as if that could be the only possible reason you could oppose it. Eisenhower governs for 8 years at the height of the early Cold War, the first Cold War. He elevates all sorts of horrid reactionaries like the Dulles brothers into office. But at the same time, he starts overseeing bit by bit the desegregation in the South. Brown versus the Board of Education occurs under his watch. And while he later came to regret having appointed Earl Warren, the Supreme Court justice who oversaw that decision, to that office, he eventually came to accept the inevitability of this whole process. He's succeeded by John F. Kennedy in 1960, who wins a very tightly contested election with Richard Nixon, in which there almost certainly were some monkeying around the edges, particularly in Illinois, although Nixon almost certainly tried to do the same thing in Texas. Kennedy is almost the proto-Reagan in office. He is not a New Dealer. He's not a Keynesian. His father, Joseph Kennedy, had severe issues with FDR while he was president. FDR appointed him ambassador to the court of St. James, or the ambassador to England, in order to get him out of the fucking country, because he was basically a conservative Democrat and had sided with the 1928 Democrat nominee Al Smith over FDR in a lot of internecine battles here. So John Kennedy comes out of a pretty anti-New Deal tradition, even though he came to accept the logic of some of the liberalism that had been pursued there. Kennedy wants to do a round of corporate tax cuts. He thinks that the 90% ineffective tax rate, but the 90% tax rate under Eisenhower is too damn high. He's not able to get this through before he's assassinated by Oswald. I don't really have a strong opinion on the Kennedy assassination. I've seen the Oliver Stone film. I've read several books about it. I've read Stephen King's book about it. It was actually really good and actually sort of informative. But Kennedy is a Democrat who governs from a center-right basis. Kennedy is not a liberal. He's not even left-wing in a bourgeois sense. He's not an inheritor of the New Deal directly, and he's not seen as that. His vice president, Lyndon Johnson, is a man who deeply respected FDR, but had acquired a reputation as a conservative simply because that was what it took to get elected in Texas, which is where he was from at the time. So Kennedy comes in and he's lukewarm on civil rights. He's stridently anti-communist, though. He's a Hawks hawk, and most of the early generation of neoconservatives came out of a circle that were influenced by Kennedyism. Jeane Kirkpatrick, I think, was either an aide to Kennedy somehow or related to an aide to Kennedy, but it doesn't matter. Johnson replaces Kennedy, and he immediately begins by betraying, for example, Richard Russell, who had been his mentor in the Senate and was a staunch hawkish segregationist and conservative Democrat. Johnson breaks the back of the conservative Democrats in 1964 by pushing through his Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act itself doesn't do much. It's basically a bit of pointless legislation that recognizes changing social realities that already existed. But it does help Johnson politically, and that's the only reason why he pushes it through. Meanwhile, he institutes a bunch of Great Society New Deal programs that absolutely wreck the economy, and set the stage for later inflation in the 1970s, and he shoves the Vietnam War down everybody's throats. But he does this while posing as a great humanitarian liberal benefactor of all mankind. Lyndon Johnson was an absolute scumbag, and if you can ever read the Robert Caro books on the subject, you'll kind of get a sense of who the man was. He's opposed by Barry Goldwater of Arizona in the 1964 election, who is probably the first explicitly conservative Republican nominee. But Goldwater is Jewish and comes from a family of shopkeepers in Arizona. Later in the 80s and the 90s, Goldwater comes to expose his own libertarian intellectual leanings. He opposes Ronald Reagan's moral majority. Jerry Falwell, he I think had a gay son or a gay grandson, and that sort of influenced him in this direction. This already was his natural pre-existing milieu. This is his tradition. But in the 60s, Goldwater is threatening to drop the bomb and exfoliate or defoliate the jungles of Vietnam. He is a ultra hawk also. Johnson promises, that there won't be an expanded war and that he'll keep the peace, much as Woodrow Wilson did, 50 years previously. But of course, he wins in a landslide and then almost immediately starts pounding away at the Vietnamese. Johnson's popularity sinks, and the social movements of the 60s take a foothold in America. And there's feedback between these movements and the Democratic Party. They start informing and influencing each other in some very interesting ways, and you have to go into the micro-history of it. I would recommend Century of the Self, which is an excellent documentary, and takes a look at how some of these movements sort of interpolate each other up and down the line. The Democrats don't immediately reject everything the New Left is saying. They try to incorporate some of it into their hegemonic status. Moving on, Nixon comes in after Johnson, and Nixon is a moderate Republican and has always been a moderate Republican, except on two issues. On the Vietnam War, he's an ultra hawk at first. He accuses the Johnson administration of not doing enough to see it to its end, but while in office, he cools his heels a little bit and pursues Vietnamization. And then on domestic issues, he cut his teeth on the Alger Hiss case. Alger Hiss was a associate of the Roosevelt administration. He was a communist who, again, like so much of the official bourgeois left, gets sucked up into assisting Roosevelt's attempt to construct social democracy in America. And Nixon pursued him and outed him as an agent of the USSR when he found a roll of film in a pumpkin patch that Hiss or one of his associates, I can't recall, had hidden there. The Hiss case made Nixon a household name, and he goes on to defeat Helen Gahagan Douglas in the senatorial race in 1948 during a Republican sweep of Congress. Nixon is not a modern conservative in the sense that he's not intrinsically opposed to all social programs. He wants to streamline and simplify Johnson's Great Society programs and make them more amenable to the business classes. In particular, he thinks that he can target the minority, the blacks, and the minority business class. He can target them with controlled social programs that benefit them to the exclusion of the urban lumpen proletariat, and so on. Nixon is a very complicated figure. He is he's a rhetorical conservative, an intellectual moderate who sees the need to impose to impose some discipline upon the new left and upon the social movements that were originating at this time. And towards this end, he okays a lot of these efforts to do this. He oversees Operation Chaos, which was an infiltration of the new left by the CIA and other agencies. But while this is all going on, there's interpolation between these government spooks and the new left movement. The CIA, for example, famously started promoting Michel Foucault as their favored theorist, and started to give him mainstream acceptance within American academia. It's not just a negative dialectic, but a negative and positive interpolation of each other as these movements inform and influence each other in various ways. Nixon is the president who officially removes America from the gold standard. He closes the gold window. And this is ostensibly to prevent foreign speculators from being able to buy up America's gold and ship it overseas to empty out Fort Knox. Uh, but what it really does in reality is impose fiat on the whole country. Now, there are very few good Marxian analyses of fiat currency. My interpretation of it is simply this. Previously, under the Spanish dollar and then the American dollar, you had a system in which the value of the commodity money was determined by the value of the labor required to mint and mine it, as I've said before. Uh, whether silver, whether gold, it makes no difference. When you transition to fiat currency, you have the effect of replacing the labor value required to create the commodity metal with the labor required to reproduce the state itself. So that the dollar is now backed not by the labor required to mine and mint gold, but by the labor required to reproduce the American state. And consequently, all currencies around the world that are backed by the value of the American dollar are actually backed by the value required to reproduce the American state. So, Nixon does this, and then the economy immediately hits stagflation in the 70s, in the mid-70s. The social movements begin to slow down, particularly after the Hells Angels broke open a bunch of heads at a Rolling Stones concert in California, and that sort of set everyone afright. And then the Manson murders in August of 1969 really sealed the deal. Whether you think that Manson was a CIA patsy, or whether you think that Manson was a cult guru, or whether you think he was completely innocent, or whether you think he had a connection to the Protestant Church, it makes no difference. That had a cumulative impact here. Although, meanwhile, the new left is slowly acclimating itself towards power and slowly pushing towards power. Nixon gets kicked out, and Gerald Ford assumes office. And Gerald Ford is the first president since John F. Kennedy to pursue something approximating a conservative economic program. His Whip Inflation Now program, while laughable in hindsight, in fact, he can't go back to the gold standard to control inflation, so he tries to encourage domestic austerity through Whip Inflation Now, but it proves unpopular. Ford, by the way, is responsible for atrocities in Indonesia under Suharto, but Ford gets owned in 1976 by Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter, for all of his religious rhetoric that he's a good man and, Habitat for Humanity and this, Carter is the first real neoliberal president. And until this is understood, the whole history of the last 40 years will make no sense. Carter, not Reagan, is the first religious right president, even though he doesn't pursue any of this in politics, and this will never get pursued officially. Carter, not Reagan, starts deregulation. He deregulates the airlines, and he deregulates beer, and he deregulates heavy transportation. Carter, not Reagan, he pursues a military expansionist program to confront the USSR on the basis of human rights. Carter, not Reagan, pursues like a low-key racist Southern strategy. He's quoted in the New York Times during the 1976 campaign as calling for the ethnic purity of white communities and black communities. Carter is a conservative, and admits that he's a conservative in some of his campaign speeches. And Reagan even writes an op-ed stating that he is sufficiently conservative and Republicans should give him a chance. But apparently not enough, because Reagan sensed blood in the water and came in and, beat him out, and Carter loses. Incidentally, Carter killed any chance of universal health care in the United States. Teddy Kennedy, the senator from Massachusetts, proposed it, and Carter shoots it down. So Reagan comes in. Reagan, of course, is Reagan and governs the way that we all know that he does. But it's interesting, and I've mentioned this in video after video, he calls for the co-optation of the American economy. He calls for workers to control the means of production. Well, why would a conservative Republican call for worker control of the means of production? Because there's nothing radical about it, and because it will empower finance capital. And what this all represents, this movement here, is towards the rule of finance capital as opposed to the old industrial capitalist establishment that came out and was empowered by the Civil War and was only started to be weakened under the New Deal. This all represents a transition towards a liquid logic, or a logic of sort of a post-modernity, but it occurs piece by piece by piece. Reagan cannot push his program through because he loses Congress in 1986. I think he loses the Senate in 1986. He might have lost the House in 82. I can't recall precisely. But he's personally popular, but basically politically non-functional. And personally non-functional late into his term. He's replaced by George H.W. Bush, who, other than the Gulf War, is more or less a non-entity. Bush tries to govern as a centrist Rockefeller Republican, a moderate Republican, but he knows that he's going to lose in '92, so he puts Pat Buchanan on the stage, gives a culture war speech at the convention, and then he's out. He tries to make a hard right turn, he loses. Clinton comes in and he's already compromised. He's already cutting deals with the conservatives. He decides not to raise taxes at the behest of Alan Greenspan. He pushes hard austerity as a measure. He's tough on crime. He's a new Democrat, but in fact, this just means going back to the old democracy of Jimmy Carter. And Clinton governs like a third and fourth term of Ronald Reagan. He's out. George W. Bush comes in, and this starts to be where most of my viewers probably can pick up some of their political history from in their own personal lives. But there is an inherent progressive thread here. It is the intermingling of the progressive and the conservative, the dialectical interplay of these forces that propels history forward. The left, the whole left, is complicit in this from beginning to end.